If you have any questions, you can chat them to me in the chat or raise your hand. I mean, I'll be able to see everyone. I'm going to mute everybody right now. Joyce, please unmute, and Susie, please unmute. And now, Susie, you can take it away.
Okay, well, I just want to introduce Joyce Williams and Rosemary Heilimann. Joyce has served as Director of Voter Registration and is a board member of the League of Women Voters for Deerfield, I'm guessing, right? Is that?
No, I'm the LaGrange area.
Or LaGrange area, okay, I'm sorry. She is a founding member of the League of Women Voters for Deerfield, the Electoral College Committee, created during the 2017 Biennial Convention of the LWV of Illinois. And Rosemary is a retired teacher who's been a member of the League of Women Voters for 42 years, first in Glenview, and now as a member of the League of Women Voters, Deerfield and Lincolnshire. And thank you so much for being here. Sorry it's a small group, but we're a dedicated bunch and very interested in what you have to say. So thank you.
Yes, and as Rosemary has already mentioned, we have absolutely no issue talking to small groups. As she shared earlier, we've spoken with a group of one before, and that's fine with us. We're very dedicated to this cause. So I appreciate anybody who's willing to take the time to try to learn more about this issue. We're hoping that this presentation is very educational. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. There we go. So can everybody see that now?
We can.
Terrific. And I'm trying to figure out, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say you haven't gotten it going yet, right? Yep.
Yeah. Yes, I'm trying to figure out what happened to my, there it is. It was just covered up. So I just wanted to make it a little bit bigger. So welcome to this presentation. This is from the League of Women Voters, and we have created what we call an interleague committee that is focused on the Electoral College. And we founded that in 2017. And since then, we've been doing presentations like this around the community to league members and to other civic organizations, to really anybody who wants to learn more about the Electoral College and learn about our position, which is that it needs to be abolished through an amendment to the US Constitution. So today we're going to share some of the League's history about it, and importantly, why we think this is an especially critical issue today. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with a little bit of background. We already did introductions. I'm going to show you the specific League position, and I'm going to take you through Electoral College 101. So this might remind you of your high school or junior high civics class a little bit, but for most of us, that's probably been a while, and you may not remember all the details. Then we're going to talk about the history of the Electoral College. We have more on the history, but today we're going to focus on the part about the racist origins of the Electoral College. Probably something they didn't tell you about in your high school civics class. Then we're going to focus in on what we learned through the 2020 election about the specific vulnerabilities of the Electoral College and what we learned about that. We've been doing this presentation, as I said, since 2017, and we thought we had covered every base we needed to cover. And the 2020 election and its aftermath made us go, duh, we didn't think we'd have to talk about this part, but now we do. And then we're going to talk a little bit, it's not really convention here, this was a presentation we did at convention, but a little bit about what you can do to help this cause if you're so moved. And I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A at the end, because as I said, that's our favorite part, and that's how we continue to learn, is by listening to smart people talk and ask questions, and then we realize things we might have missed covering. So when we talk about this Electoral College Committee that includes all of these local Illinois leagues, Deerfield, Lincolnshire, Roselle, Bloomingdale, Park Forest, LaGrange area, Champaign County, Highland Park, Highwood, and Wheaton, and more are joining every day. And we also have several people who are from other states who are league members, who as individuals have joined our committee and have done a lot of work. So as we said, since 2017, what we've done is we've created educational presentations like this one. They include scripts and some handouts. We formed a speakers bureau of people like me who have no problem getting up and talking to people who like to talk. We've offered our materials to local leagues and given over 50 presentations in Illinois alone with over 2,000 people reached. I'm going to have to check the numbers and see if we've hit 3,000 by now. I think we probably have. What we're poised to do is to go national. We'd like to offer this educational campaign all over the country, and in the most recent convention, which just happened this summer, we will be working with LWV US to take an educational presentation nationwide. So we're excited about that. Okay. So what is the League's position? This was actually first written in 1970. And it started, the League of Women Voters of the United States believes that the direct popular vote method for electing the president and vice president is essential to representative government. The League therefore believes that the Electoral College should be abolished. And then later it was added to this, and this was in 2010, the League added support for the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact as one acceptable way to achieve the goal of direct popular vote until abolition is accomplished. Now, I'm not going to go into detail today about what the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is, but in brief, it is an agreement among a group of states and DC to award all their electoral votes to whichever presidential candidate wins the overall popular vote nationwide. And the compact would go into effect when enacted by states that possess the 270 electoral college votes that are needed to win. So we do know something about that, but we're not really the experts on it. Okay, so what has the activity been? Well, in 1970-71, LWVU actually testified in front of Congress to amend the Constitution and lobbied for an amendment to the Constitution to replace the Electoral College with direct election of the president. At that time, the measure actually passed the House and almost passed the Senate. Unfortunately, the bill in the Senate was filibustered by Southern Democrats who feared that a popular vote would weaken their state's power in presidential elections because voter suppression tactics in their states reduced the number of popular votes. But it would have no impact on the electoral votes. So the bill died. We came this close in 1970 to abolishing the Electoral College. In 1997, the League again testified in Washington, D.C., calling for an amendment to end the Electoral College. And then in 2001, after the Gore-Bush election, a memo from the League was sent to all state and local leagues, reminding them of the League position to abolish the Electoral College. In 2018, Rosemary and I were there when we asked and got passed a resolution at convention urgently reaffirming the League's long-held position that the Electoral College should be abolished. That convention also voted to support the National Popular Vote Task Force. Then in 2020, the League convention voted to add abolition of the Electoral College as an action focus. And then in the most recent, which didn't even get on this slide yet, in Denver this summer, just last month, direct election of the president and vice president was added to the LWV US priority list for 2022 to 2024, and in fact, really for the next several decades. So that's exciting, and we're waiting to see, what's going to happen next, and Rosemary and I will be working on that. So that's what the League background is. But now let's talk about Electoral College 101. So cast your mind back to that civics class. I'm assuming you all have at least heard of the Electoral College, and you probably know more about it than the average citizen knows. But to make sure we're all on the same page, we're going to give you a brief summary. So first, the Electoral College is not a place, it's not a school, it's not a building. It's a group of what is currently 538 people who elect the president and vice president of the United States. Each state gets a specific number of electors, which is based on their congressional delegation. So you get one elector for each US senator and 1 elector for each US representative. So in 2020, Illinois had 20 electors. In 2024, it will be down to 19. The District of Columbia, although it's not a state, does get 3 electors. And now, according to the US Constitution, each state legislator gets to decide how they want their electors chosen. So over time, initially when this first started, way back in the late 1700s and early 1800s, state legislators just picked the electors themselves. There was no election, nothing. That was perfectly fine. Over time, each state by state decided to start changing that, and they started to choose electors by having a popular election within the state. But importantly, it's the state legislatures get to decide how they want to do this. So the winner of the Electoral College, however, is not just whoever gets the most votes. Somebody has to get the majority of votes. So currently that is at 270 votes are needed to win. If no candidate gets a majority, if it's a 3-way split, which people feared in 1968 election was going to happen, then it goes into the US House of Representatives, and the US House of Representatives decides who the president will be. They do not have to decide based on the popular vote or anything like that. They just get to decide. And importantly, at that point, each state gets 1 vote. So Wyoming gets the same number of votes as California. Rhode Island gets the same number of votes as New York. Every state gets just 1 vote. Similarly, the Senate chooses then the vice president. Okay. So unless you've been an elector yourself, no one in this room has ever voted directly for president. When you cast your vote, you're actually voting for a group of people who have been chosen by their political party to vote for their party's candidate. So you can see on the left there are only a handful of states left who actually show this on their ballot. This is the Arizona ballot from 2016. And so it can show that the Trump-Pence electors were Bruce Ashe and Walter Begay Jr., et cetera. And the Clinton-Kaine presidential electors were Delia Carlisle and Gabrielle Giffords. But most of them are like us in Illinois. When we go in and do our ballot, we show the sample ballot here from 2020. All it lists is the name of the candidate. It doesn't list the actual electors. So especially people who are a little bit younger, who've forgotten their civics class already, that it doesn't, it's not really clear to them. I have one quick question because I'm getting a note from Rosemary. Are people be able to hear me clearly, or is there a bad echo? I want to check if it's Rosemary's.
There's a teeny tiny bit of an echo, but I can hear you.
Okay, because I'm not sure where the echo is coming from, so I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah, it could be in your settings. Maybe just turn. Let's see if you just turn it down a little bit.
Okay. Let me think. I'm trying to think. Not sure where to go to do it. Let me try something else. I'm taking out, I was using some earbuds.
Oh, yeah, try that.
Turn these off. Okay, can you still hear me?
I can still hear you, but there's
Okay, I can't hear you.
Well, that's the problem.
All right, I'm gonna have to go into my settings.
All right.
Okay,
Susan
I
says,
have my speaker up. All
Susan
right,
says
Vanessa,
it's
could you
okay.
talk again, please?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Still not hearing anything.
You can put the
Okay.
buds in because we could
Start
hear you.
with
It was
this.
loud enough.
Joyce, the buds didn't make the difference, so just go back to what you're doing.
Yeah.
Other people aren't having that same problems, so.
Okay. I'm still trying. Oops, wrong thing. All right, I'll try one more time and then otherwise we'll just have to move forward and hope for the best.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, Vanessa, one more try to see if I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
No, I don't. All right,
Okay.
I'm putting these back in so I can listen to you.
Okay, that's fine. We're good. We're good.
Okay. So, so again, none of you have voted directly for the president. So when does the actual election happen? It doesn't happen in November. It happens on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. And that's when all the electors meet within their states to officially cast their votes. And you can see that happening back in 2016 on the left there from Arizona. So every state except Maine and Nebraska have chosen a winner-take-all system, which means that whoever wins, for example, in Illinois, they get all of Illinois' electoral votes. So the votes of everybody who voted for the second place or third place candidate get completely ignored in the official election. So then what happens is each state sends their certificates of the vote, which you can see an example from Indiana in the middle, and they send that to the US archivist in DC, who then sends them on to Congress. And then on January 6th, a day that will now live in infamy, is when Congress meets in a joint session to count and certify the electoral votes. The vice president acts as sort of the chairperson of that meeting because they are president of the Senate, and announces the results of the vote. Now, during this meeting, any member of Congress can object to the electoral votes from any state. If objections are made by at least one senator and one representative, Congress has to stop the meeting and vote on the objection. Now, it seems like that probably never happened, right? Well, it happened all the time in the past. It happened a lot. And in fact, in 2017, Democratic representatives objected 11 times, but no senator joined them. So it was sort of a for the record, but it didn't stop things, and it just moved on. Okay, so that's the basics of how the Electoral College works and what the timeline is. But now I'd like to focus your attention on 3 ways in which the Electoral College system is different from every other election that we hold in this country, which is based on the popular vote. So there are 3 pillars of a democratic popular vote system. 1 is that the people vote directly for their representatives. 2 is that each person gets 1 vote, no more, no less. Nobody's votes get extra weight or less weight. And 3, the candidate with the most votes wins. All right, seems pretty simple, right? Well, in the Electoral College, what happens is it's an indirect vote, as we've talked about. Second, 1 person does not equal 1 vote in the Electoral College system, because a vote carries more or less weight depending on which state that vote is cast in. So I currently live in Illinois, and so if I take that as my baseline, if I move to a lower populated state, let's say Wyoming, suddenly my vote matters more, because every state gets the same number of electors, gets 2 electors, because every state has 2 senators. So basically, larger population states, votes count less, and lower population states, votes count more. And third, the candidate, again, who receives the most votes by the people may or may not end up living in the White House. And we've seen that twice in just this century. It's happened 5 times over the course of American history. So there are many, many reasons the Electoral College is bad for democracy, but I only have time to briefly mention the rest. I'm not going to go into detail here. 1 is that, of course, that it makes many people feel, and correctly in many cases, that their vote doesn't actually count. So therefore, if I'm a Democrat who is living in a Republican-dominated state, my vote doesn't count. And if I'm a Republican in a Republican-dominated state, I may feel they don't need my vote. It's a fait accompli as to who's going to win. And our analyses have shown that actually voter turnout decreases in any state that is not a swing state. So in those so-called safe states, voter turnout is much lower than in swing states. It also, the Electoral College polarizes our nation by pitting states against states. People act like everybody who lives in a certain state, because that state always goes Republican or Democrat, that they are all the same. Every single state in our country has both Republicans and Democrats within that state. And finally, as we've seen, it makes us more vulnerable to election fraud and to hacking. And we'll talk more about that in detail when we talk about the 2020 election. So what can we do about this? Well, we can abolish it. What it takes is to amend the US Constitution, which again, thinking back to civics class, it has to be proposed by a 2/3 vote in both the US House and the US Senate. And then it goes to the states and it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the US states. It does not, it's important to note, it does not require a constitutional convention, and the League does not support a constitutional convention to accomplish this. So those are the basics about the Electoral College. I hope I haven't bored you all to tears if you all knew all of this already. But next, what I want to do is talk about the myths. And when we do these presentations, we always hear the yeah buts, like, yeah, but. So we're going to go through those and bust those myths one by one. Okay. And again, these are not just things that we put up to like knock them down. These are the things that we hear all the time when we do these presentations. The first, well, without the Electoral College, our presidents would all be chosen by a couple of big states like California and New York. So let's run through the numbers and see if that could actually play out. Well, first of all, I'd like to point out that California and New York are not our two biggest states. In fact, New York is the 4th biggest state by population. Texas and Florida both have larger population and more electoral votes than New York does. And then second, all states, as I've said, have both Democrat and Republican voters. So you can see in the state of California, 34% identify as Republican. That is millions and millions of Republican votes that are tossed in the trash because they're ignored, and all of California's Electoral College votes go typically to the Democrat. Similarly, Texas and Florida both have large populations of both Democrats and Republicans. And in New York, again, just like California, New York has 38% of the population identifies as Republican. So every state has both Democrat and Republican voters. The other thing, we just took an in-depth look to see how many votes, how many states does it realistically take in today's modern America to elect a president? So we looked at the 2012 votes for Barack Obama by state, starting on the left with the state where he got the largest number of votes, and that was in California. So we're talking about the popular vote and how many states did Barack Obama need to win the popular vote. So after California, then we added New York, Florida, Texas, Illinois, Pennsylvania, on and on and on. In 2012, Barack Obama needed a little over 63 million votes to win the popular votes. It took 39 states for Barack Obama to win the popular vote. And a lot of that is because our country is very, it's almost 50-50 split in some ways. So it takes a vast majority of states, not just one or two or even a handful, to win the popular vote. So the fact is that if we switch to a popular vote system, votes from all states would be valued. It means that every vote counts, and it's mathematically impossible for an election by popular vote to be determined by just the largest states. And we've done this analysis by cities as well, or just the largest cities. What it actually means is that every person is equally represented regardless of where they live. Voters from swing states would count just the same as voters from safe states. And a California Republican's vote would count just the same as a California Democrat's. The next myth that we hear is that smaller, less populated states need the protection of the Electoral College to ensure that their interests are represented by the president. Okay, so this is a nice sounding thing, small states shouldn't just be run over all of the time, but it assumes that there's this thing called a small state interest, that small states somehow vote as a bloc. Well, in fact, once again, we went back to the data and we looked at 2016, and we looked at the smallest 16 states, and then we looked at the largest 16 states. And the smallest 16 states were equally split. 8 voted for Clinton and 8 voted for Trump. And in the largest 16 states, it was a very similar split, with 7 voting for Clinton and 9 voting for Trump. So there is no small state interest. They don't vote as a bloc. So the Electoral College is not protecting small state or large state interests because different small states have different interests and different large states have different interests. Even the smallest state has diversity within it, and it's a fallacy to suggest when a state goes red or blue that this represents the entire state. So then there are people who say, yeah, but it protects the rights of the minority from tyranny of the majority. And that's a really tyranny of the majority. That's a scary sounding phrase, right? And protecting minority rights is a big issue in large countries. The founding fathers actually designed our government to make sure that small states were not overpowered by large states in every interest. And as a result, 2 or 3 branches of government are designed specifically to ensure the protection of minority rights. And what are those? The US Supreme Court and the US Senate. So the first is the courts, which is designed to ensure the constitutional rights of the individual. We can argue whether that's been happening recently or not. But the US Senate specifically was designed to make sure that every state got equal representation in one of our branches of government. And that in the Senate, Wyoming gets heard just as loudly as New York, even though New York has tons more people than Wyoming. And frankly, the fact is that minority groups' rights are protected by the courts and by the Constitution, not by the Electoral College. We don't protect minority rights by giving them extra voting power. We don't say you're a member of a cultural minority and therefore you get extra votes. That's not how we do it. All of our votes should count equally, and our president is supposed to represent all the people just as fairly and equally as possible. And another, this may be our last one, I can't remember, abolishing the Electoral College will mostly benefit Democratic candidates. And this has become a very partisan split, which I think is unfortunate because this is actually a myth. In the 2 most recent elections where the popular vote was different from the Electoral College vote, it was that the popular vote was won by Democrats and the electoral vote was won by Republicans. However, let's look at the 2004 presidential election, another recent one, and that was the Bush-Kerry election, if you don't remember. And this is how it actually went. So the winner was George Bush. This was W, not HW, the son. And he had 286 electoral votes versus John Kerry's 251. And you can see in the little pie graph on the right, Bush also received about 3 million more votes than John Kerry. So it was consistent. He won both the popular vote and the electoral vote. But how close would it have been? How much difference would it have been that George Bush could have actually lost this election? Well, this map shows that. And if you can't see the difference, I don't blame you. Because the difference is only about 119,000 votes in the state of Ohio. That's the only one. I'll flip back. Ohio, we flipped from red to blue. If John Kerry had received only 119,000 more votes in Ohio, he would have won the Electoral College, even though he still would have lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. So that's how close it came to a Republican winning the popular vote, but losing the electoral vote. Frankly, in some ways, I feel like it's a shame it didn't happen because then both Republicans and Democrats would be up in arms and we'd be able to get rid of this thing. So in the future, it can and indeed can hurt Republicans as well as Democrats. It is a nonpartisan issue. And another way to look at it, I'll just briefly add, is that why do we have a 2-party system in this country, whereas most countries have more than 2 parties? It's because of the Electoral College. Because you have to win a majority in the Electoral College, both of the major parties fear nothing more than a strong third party. That's what they thought was going to happen in 1968 when Richard Nixon won. But there was a strong third party candidate and they were all afraid that that candidate was going to make it so that nobody won the Electoral College by a majority. And so in 1968 through 1970, Richard Nixon a famous Republican, supported abolishing the Electoral College because it almost hurt him. Okay, so I'm going to go through a little bit of the history, as I said, and we're not going to go in depth on that as we do in some other presentations. If you're interested, believe me, Rosemary and I can talk for days. But we're going to talk about one thing and why it was created. And a lot of it, and a lot of that original constitutional convention was about compromise. And one compromise that they didn't talk a lot about in my history lesson was that the Electoral College was fundamentally a compromise between northern and southern states because of the large number of enslaved people who lived in the South. So here's the room where it happened. I happen to love Hamilton, the musical. This was a very long, hot summer in 1787, and the original college, the 13 original colonies were getting together to create a new constitution. And each of them could send delegates to represent them. There were a total of 55 delegates representing 12 of the original 13 states. And they included a lot of the famous names of the time: George Washington, Ben Franklin, James Madison, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and others we may not remember quite as well. There were a lot of debates and arguments about representation in Congress, the powers of the president, and how to elect the president. And one of the biggest and most divisive issues was slavery, and it influenced most of these debates. And in fact, before the convention started, there was an expectation that there was going to be this big small state, large state debate. And they thought that was going to be the #1 debate. And there were certainly issues around that. As you can see, this is the population of the 13 original states. Virginia was so much bigger than everybody else, and poor Rhode Island and Delaware were teeny, teeny, tiny, to the point that Rhode Island actually refused to participate in this convention because they were afraid small states would just be ignored. But what happened is about halfway through the convention, James Madison wrote, and I'm quote at the bottom, "It seems now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interest lies not between large and small, but between the northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences form the line of discrimination." So why was that? Well, it was because who out of their population could vote and who could not. So if we look at the very early census and the population in the 5 southern states versus the 7 northern states, you will see that they had roughly the same total population, about 1.8 million people. But you see that big red chunk in the southern states? That is the enslaved population. And that took away over 600,000 voters, essentially, from their ability to vote. And again, this was northern and southern states. Some of the northern states actually still had some slavery at that time, but it was a very tiny percentage of the population. So this split, when we read about this, it's really striking that the delegates, again, there were 55 delegates, 25 of them were slave owners out of the 55. And none of them actually stood up and defended slavery and said it's a good thing. A lot of them said things like slavery is evil and that would naturally fade away on its own because it was bad. Madison himself had that attitude, but he kept enslaved people still, even though he thought it was evil. And many of them did. And Madison helped craft compromises to accommodate the southern states. And why did they do that? Well, the goal was to form one country, and the southern states were adamant that they were willing to walk and not join this new nation if there weren't accommodations for their large slaveholding population. And James Madison, I will give him credit, he was willing to say the words slavery, whereas others never seemed to want to say that. They talked in code a lot. He told his fellow delegates that direct election of the president would be unfair to the South because the right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the North. In other words, more people could vote in the North, and that the South could have no influence in a popular election on the score of the Negroes, because of course they couldn't vote. So he went on to make it clear that the Electoral College eliminated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to the fewest objections. as we saw happening as late as 1970, that because of continued difficulties or refusals to let Black people vote, Southern states enjoyed the Electoral College because it gave them outside power, whereas direct popular vote would reduce their power. And as many have stated, the Electoral College nobody was thrilled with it, but it was a compromise that everybody could agree on. Another period in history I want to point to is post-Civil War and the Reconstruction period. The Electoral College was also key in ending Reconstruction after Civil War. And if you remember the Reconstruction era, that was from 1865 to 1877. It was a brief post-Civil War period when African Americans in the South were given civil and legal rights as full citizens. For the first time in the South, you can see from the cartoon there on the left, Black people could vote, and they did vote. And on the right, the first African Americans were elected to Congress. And this was all made possible by the presence of US troops who were stationed in the South after the Civil War to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And so what happened? Well, the election of 1876. This is one I had a hard time remembering, because this was that famous Samuel J. Tilden versus Rutherford B. Hayes election, one that most of us think about very often. There were serious allegations of voting fraud in 4 states, in Florida, North Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon. Both sides claimed that they had won. So it was a big old mess. And as a result, Tilden did not get a majority in the Electoral College. Nobody did. So Tilden won the popular vote, but he did not get the majority in the Electoral College. So the two parties got together, and in one of those nice little backroom deals came up with a compromise. So what did they compromise away? Well, basically the civil rights of Black people in the South. What they agreed to was that Rutherford B. Hayes could become president in exchange for removing the federal troops who were enforcing the civil rights for African Americans in the South. So the states of the Confederacy, the former Confederacy, were once again allowed to rule themselves, and they quickly started passing a series of laws that we came to know as Jim Crow laws. And so the civil and voting rights of Black people were systematically destroyed by state laws and local ordinances. And that lasted for almost 100 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the Electoral College was created because of slavery, and the Electoral Count Act of 1887 allowed racism to continue unchecked. Not the proudest part of our history. All right. So now so that was about some of the aspects of racism in the Electoral College. There are other things, but those are some of the most blatant. Next, we're going to talk about the vulnerabilities of the Electoral College and how in the election of 2020, there were concerted efforts to exploit those vulnerabilities to flip the election results. And as I said, we never imagined that we'd have to talk about this part, but we do. So January 6th is all in our minds. It was a terrible day, but it was not where it started. It was not the beginning of the attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. There were lots of opportunities. So let's start before January 6th. So let's go back to November and December. As we've seen, the official vote for president doesn't happen in November. It happens in mid-December when the electors meet in each state to cast their votes. It's usually a ceremonial event, barely gets even mentioned on the news. But in 2020, while the popular vote was still being finalized, attempts to overturn the election results had already begun. The Electoral College provided a handy roadmap for how to overturn the election by manipulating the tiniest number of electoral votes. It was already clear that there was no way to win the popular vote. There was an insurmountable lead of over 7 million popular votes. So they knew that you couldn't do that. But the electoral vote, well, gee, all that needed to be was to quote unquote find just an additional 38 electoral votes. And that's a lot easier, right, than 7+ million. So the Electoral College also provided a handy-dandy roadmap. You could zero in on those specific states as the hunting ground. So you can see here the highlighting that there were just 7 states that partisan operatives needed to look. So it gave them this roadmap and said, you don't have to deal with the whole country, just focus on these 7 states. And those were states where the candidate lost by a narrow margin in the popular vote. So I'm going to zero in on Wisconsin now, our neighbors to the north, and what happened there. On November 18th, the losing candidate demanded a vote recount in 2 selected counties, not even the whole state. But the recount resulted in a net gain of 87 votes for the other candidate. Oops, that didn't work. So try again. A resolution was submitted to the Wisconsin state legislature to decertify the victory in Wisconsin. Now, that luckily this was rejected as having no basis in law. And let's have another try at it. On December 14th, while the Wisconsin's real electors were meeting to cast the state's 10 electoral votes, we showed you that picture earlier, electors loyal to the losing candidate also met and conducted a bogus vote for their candidate. So I'm zeroing in on Wisconsin. Similar shenanigans were going on in those other states. And in 2020, in fact, 63 lawsuits were filed by the losing campaign before state and federal courts, including the US Supreme Court. Ultimately, they were all dropped or dismissed. But I want to show you another example. These events were apparently coordinated. So you can see here, remember we talked about those certificates of votes? And here I could find 5 of them out of those 7 states. So I've got Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin. On the left in each case, you can see the real official certificate of electoral votes. And on the right, the ones that were created, the fake ones that were created by the losing candidates people. All the fake certificates were printed on plain white paper. They all used the exact same font. They all had the same spacing. They all had virtually the same wording. Now, the Justice Department will have to determine whether this was a criminal event, but it's very clear that it was a coordinated event. So regardless of what the Justice Department decides, we all now have seen that the Electoral College system leaves our presidential elections vulnerable to this type of attempted manipulation. And then we finally get to January 6th. So again, that was certainly not the beginning. There were a lot of attempts during the joint section of Congress. 147 members, 8 senators, and 139 representatives voted to reject electoral votes from Arizona and Pennsylvania. And the vice president, as we know, was pressured to refuse to count electoral ballots from targeted states. It seems that the idea was to throw it into the House of Representatives so that neither Trump nor Biden would have the required majority, 270 votes. So it would go into the House of Representatives with each state having 1 vote, and the losing candidate felt pretty assured that he would win that. So again, I'm going to end this analysis or this discussion about the vulnerability of the Electoral College to manipulation with an analysis was done by a mathematics professor from the University of Southern California. He looked at 17 presidential elections where the popular vote was so close that changing a small number of votes in just a few states would have changed who won the electoral vote and the presidency. Now, I cannot say that I'm a mathematician and I completely understand this analysis, but what he concluded was that the Electoral College system is more vulnerable to manipulation than a national direct popular vote simply because of the sheer number of votes. And his conclusion was that the Electoral College system is 4 times more vulnerable to manipulation than a national popular vote. So that's a lot. Okay. So I know we've covered a lot of different topics and I probably talked too fast, but I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to discuss. And before we start that, what can you do? Here's what we would ask if you are so moved to share this presentation with others within your group, with others within your community, to everybody who's willing to listen. You can share it yourself. We will give you the slides and the script to use if you feel confident in doing it yourself. If you want to request a speaker from our Speakers Bureau, just email us at abolishelectoral@gmail.com, and Rosemary or I will get back to you. Second, continue to educate yourself about the need for a direct vote for president and vice president. Even if you just have, I have had conversations with people who are vehemently opposed to eliminating the Electoral College. And as long as I kept the discussion civil, even though sometimes the other person did not start out that way, there were cusses and name calling, as long as I maintained calm civility, everything got dialed down. And by the end, I wouldn't say that I necessarily made a convert, but it was somebody who felt less irate on the whole topic and was actually willing to listen to another viewpoint. And I consider that a victory. Our biggest problem, though, is not so much the vehement antis, as people who think everything you just said is right, but it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. And yes, it's never going to happen if people don't stand up and make it happen. Our Constitution is not easy to amend, but it has been done 27 times. Thank you very much. It can happen again. Is it going to happen overnight? No, but it's never going to happen if we don't work for it. And finally, just keep your ears open. I think in 2023, we're going to hear more from the League of Women Voters on the national level, and hopefully word will spread about this and you'll be able to hear more about it. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. And I'd like to open it up to questions, comments. Rosemary can probably unmute herself, or someone can unmute her, and she can help answering questions.
And Joyce, why don't you stop sharing your screen? We can see everybody then, or I can help you do that.
Okay.
Okay, I think I can.
Sorry, I'm still unable to hear, so I'm trying to fix my audio.
Wow,
So
okay.
keep going.
All right, so I'll just, oh, look, there's some pictures of my grandchild, and now back to our regularly scheduled program. Okay, who has questions? You can unmute yourself. We're a small group. I think you can.
I actually found it really interesting because back in 2016, after Trump won, I was very interested in all the things trying to use the Electoral College to negate that victory. So I remember seeing a lot of things and signing things, ask the electors to not, elect Trump. So I guess it does go both ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you shared with us at the end, that the Electoral College is, subject, or, it's easily manipulated is a scary thing for me. And of course, what happened on January 6th continues to be very scary.
And I follow up on Vanessa's comment. The example I like to mention in that regard is, do you remember Rudy Giuliani sitting in front of the Michigan legislature with that woman, and he was trying to get the Michigan legislature to overturn their election. And the only reason they couldn't do it is they hadn't written legislation to allow them to do it. So now in some of the states, there are bills being brought to allow the state legislatures to decide the election regardless of the vote, which is how it is in the Constitution. The Constitution does not guarantee that the people vote for president. The Constitution says that the legislatures decide how to pick the electors. So if they write a bill for themselves saying, oh, we can overturn it, for whatever reason they might say, if it looks crooked, or if if it's going to be dangerous, we can choose the electors ourselves. And that's a real thing.
Right. And although I guess nascently I knew it was a racist construction, what you showed us just makes it very much more concrete. And I think for some people who say, oh, why do we have to do this, that it's a racist construct, we should work to abolish it.
Mhm. There have been some analyses that I have not vetted or we have not vetted personally that say that even just because of the populations of where African Americans live in the country, that their votes as a group are devalued versus white people voting. We need to get to that analysis before we start presenting it ourselves, but the people who have done it, I believe, have probably done a good job, but I can't prove it yet. So as you can see, we're big on going back to the sources and not just listening to what somebody says out there.
Which we certainly appreciate. I think that living in Illinois, we say to ourselves, oh, we have, well, I know the group, so I'm just going to say, we have a Democratic governor, we have two Democratic senators. My congressperson is Brad Schneider. Any ideas on how our Illinois people come up on this topic?
Well, I will say Dick Durbin has a history of signing on. There have been bills introduced in pretty much every Congress for a while to abolish the Electoral College, and it goes into the Judicial Committee and it just kind of sits there. But Dick Durbin has actually been the sponsor of at least one of those bills. Now, Rosemary, you may know more than I do about other reps. Like, I don't know where Dan Schneider stands. I'm not even positive.
Brad.
I'm sorry, Brad. Dan Schneider's a comic, isn't he? Sorry. Anyway.
Brad is my representative also. And,
okay.
And as with so many people, the response you get is, well, it couldn't happen. It couldn't happen. And so that's our biggest hurdle is our allies who just, think it's impossible. It's not. And I think there is, a renewed interest since the January 6th hearings.
Absolutely. Now the iron now's the time to strike. The iron is hot because people witness that. And as the hearings come out and more details come out, people are absolutely, we knew it was bad. We did not know it was that bad. Is my
or that it almost worked because of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
It almost worked.
Yeah.
So
Larry?
I have a couple of questions, and for my first comment, thank you for being with us. It's very informative. The one, it would be very helpful in addition to the materials you provided, and certainly listening thoughtfully to your remarks. What's the single most important action item we can do to try to affect positive change when we live in a very blue state and we really don't need to lobby our own representatives and senators and governor and so on and so forth. We have, thankfully, we live in the right place with the right elected officials. So, what's the single most important thing we can do? And then my second comment is, I know this is different. This is more important, but I'm old enough to remember the failure of the movement to get the ERA amendment. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Actually had traction over many years. It was not that far away from making some progress, and then it died. And we seem so far away from even the progress for the ERA amendment. For those people who are old enough to remember that and feel like, well, yeah, the hopeless comment, some of that comes from older people who lived through that era, who are very pessimistic and thought, gee, that's a great idea, and it didn't happen. This one's an even better idea. So I just don't have the stomach for it. So I wonder if you could comment on all of that, and I hope that's not too much to chew on.
No, it's not. Go ahead, Rosemary.
Well, I like these questions. Okay. So first of all, as far as feeling that we have the support of our representatives and so forth, it doesn't take much. We had other governors in recent years that had completely different points of view. So, and we've had representatives that had different points of view in the 10th district in recent years. So it's important to make sure that people do vote and do support the people that reflect their values. From the league, we can't say who we want you to vote for, but we do want you to vote and to be aware and informed about who you're voting for. So it's important. But then the second part, even those representatives and governmental officials that we feel agree with us, again, that barrier of, well, where am I going to put my energy? It's not going to happen. And unless the people really make a stink and say, look, we are expecting you to do something on this, that's what we want you to do. They need that continual reminder and that voice, because it's so easy to forget about the Electoral College once the election is over, until the next crisis. Now, ERA, I have some thoughts on. First of all, actually, ERA has passed, and I do not understand what's going on with the archivist and the executive branch and why it's not being inscribed, because it has enough votes. This idea of a deadline was an artificial construct. There's no requirement for deadline in the Constitution. So it should be, and the ladies that work with us that are supporting the ERA are just furious that the archivist and the Biden administration have not gone ahead and put that in. But I know what you're talking about, because I was in high school when Phyllis Schlafly came to Evanston High School and made her big speech. And I remember being 17 years old, my girlfriend and I were very proud that we sat in the front row without standing for the ovation. We just sat there with our arms crossed. But it shows how much one person can accomplish that has the support of whichever group you have the support of. So if a person like Phyllis Schlafly could marshal the forces in Illinois to put off Illinois ratifying the ERA for so many years, then why can't we do the same thing? Marshal our friends and contacts. And then my third part of the story is at one of my early presentations, my friend Carol was in the audience, and she brought her sister-in-law, Diane. So I always used to say, the main thing is keep talking and talking about it, whether, like Joyce said, either if they're opposed or not opposed, at least you're keeping the topic on the front burner instead of people forgetting about it. So Carol told me that later that year, it's a big Italian family, they were all sitting around the Christmas dinner table, and there was a lull in the conversation. And so Diane took me at my word, and she piped up and said, so how about that Electoral College, And so, but it got a little conversation going. Well, why do you ask? Oh, we went to this presentation, blah, blah, blah. So I tell people, just do that all the time. And Joyce, I don't know what else you want to say.
I really enjoyed the Mythbusters, because I think, that's what people do say back to you.
Mhm.
So.
Yes, they do. And some of them, if they were true, would be serious concerns, but
Yes.
they're just not.
I'm sorry, Larry, you had another question.
No, I got them all
Okay.
out, and I
Yeah.
thank you for the thoughtful responses.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think it was a very, yeah, Susan?
I was just saying it was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel much better informed. I'm gonna go down and talk to my husband, who's watching some baseball all-star, whatever it is.
Mhm.
Anyway, I think this is a really important topic, and January 6th has really highlighted for all of us that we just can't be, we can't do anything about it. And we can do something about it. And it's interesting, we're still talking about Phyllis Schlafly all these years later.
Vanessa, where's the recording for everyone to be able to?
So the recording is going to be on YouTube. You go to YouTube, you Google McComb, you just put in the search, you don't Google, search in YouTube, Macomb Solel Lakeside, or you email me and I'll just send you out the link. And we'll also put the link, I'll send it to both Joyce and Rosemary, and it will be in the next Macomb at Home to remind people to go take a look at it.
And I was gonna say, I'm sorry I interrupted about the sound, Joyce. You know,
Oh, that's
evidently it was only me because other people seemed to hear okay, so I
I'm
apologize.
glad.
Yeah, don't worry. And you know what, we'll put it also on our Tikkun Olam Facebook page and maybe on our, we'll just keep, with social media, you just keep throwing it out there. You throw it out there, you throw it out there. We'll see how many views we get.
Appreciate that. That's terrific.
Yes. All right, everyone. Thank you all.
Thank
And,
you so much.
Yeah, it'll be up by tomorrow morning-ish. It takes
Yes.
a hot minute.
Thank you so much for having us. We
All
really
right.
appreciate it.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank you,
Bye.
Susan. Bye.
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 Thank you.